Hey, I'm Ron Drotos from keyboardimprov.com, and I'm very delighted to be interviewing Mr. Tedd Firth today. Ted is a wonderful pianist, and we'll get into exactly what he does in a second. But the catalyst for these interviews is my book, The Inner World of Piano Improvisation. So I'm hoping Ted, that we can talk a little bit about improvisation in general, and then some specific things about what you do. So when I think of you, Tedd Firth, New York City-based pianist, we've known each other since I guess maybe the late '90s or something like that.
Probably, yeah. Turn of the century.
Exactly, that's right. The turn of this. Oh my God, I think of Irving Berlin, right? But I guess yes, yeah. Tedd Firth and Ron Drotos, the turn of the century, and I associate you mostly with vocalists, with jazz, cabaret, some sort of pop influenced vocalists as well. How do you see yourself as a musician, specifically as a pianist and an improviser?
Well, I do work mostly with vocalists, and that actually goes back to the late '90s, actually, probably around the time we met. One of the first, well, really the first gig I got in New York was an open mic for singers up at a jazz club called Cleopatra's Needle, which is no longer in New York, but it was on Sunday afternoons. And I was young. I was, I think I was 21 when I started doing it, and I was about to start grad school. And I had done some gigs with singers prior to that, but that was sort of, that was a real immersion into that world. And I realized pretty early on that, I really enjoyed doing it. Like that I got a lot of satisfaction out of it. I met a lot of new people, learned a lot of new music, and just had a good time with it. And I just thought, well, if this is a lot of fun, let's just see where this goes. And this is where it went. But prior to that, I was a jazz piano major in school, both undergrad and graduate. I went to William Patterson University in New Jersey for my bachelor's, got my master's at Manhattan School of Music. But even while I was in school, I was still playing a lot of classical music as well. I was a jazz piano major, but I was playing a lot of classical music as well. And so I'm glad that I kept both of those things going as long as I did, education wise, because through the years, even though I do play a lot of jazz and a lot of improvised music, I do a lot of gigs where reading is required as well. So a lot of times I'm drawing on both those skill sets.
Yeah, I remember Cleopatra's Needle because I played that open mic, I think, right before you did.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I was sort of getting out of the business to spend more time with my young kids and this and that. And I remember when the first time I heard the name Tedd Firth from some singers we had both been working with, there's this new guy, Tedd Firth, he's young and, really wants to break into the scene and work with vocalists. And it seems like, so many sort of people coming from the jazz world, especially pianists, they fall into the vocal accompaniment thing mainly because there's a lot of work. Vocalists get a lot of work, and they don't necessarily, really love working with vocalists. But I think you really love working with vocalists, like I do, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. I realized early on that the fact that I did enjoy it, was a good thing, because not every jazz pianist does love doing it. And I just realized that, and singers appreciate somebody who wants to be there, and I realized, and I just thought, well, this is, if I want to be here and they like that I want to be here and I'm having a good time. So, it just seemed like a good fit. So.
Absolutely. I mean, the joy you have of playing with vocalists is evident when you play. I mean, you're smiling, you're finding these. I love watching you, especially, we'll get to it a little later, but when you're playing an out of tempo intro or rubato section, a verse of a tune under a vocalist, it's like you see the wheels turning in your mind. Should I play this chord? Oh, they did this. I'll do that, and I'm sure they feel it, right? They all feel it.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, it's fun. I like those kinds of situations because I feel that I can be very expressive, even though I have a very specifically assigned task at the moment. you're playing an intro. You can't go on, forever. There's a limit to how far you can go with this stuff. It's not like, certain situations where you just have an absolute blank canvas and, think in terms of like say a Keith Jarrett solo concert, something like that, where it's just one person sitting down at the instrument and just letting the muse speak, and so you have a smaller canvas, but I like to think that, so how can I channel some of that energy? And I used to, when I was in college and I first discovered Keith Jarrett, I thought that was so fascinating, that here's this person that can sit down and just generate what seems like a fully composed evening of music. Because isn't that like the whole idea of improvisation, is what we're sort of questing after, is to make something that's completely spontaneous sound like it was totally worked out, like going for the sort of the perfection you can get from composition. And of course you can get that because you can just keep revising your efforts. But with improvisation, you can't revise your efforts. You just throw it out there and that's it. So I was always fascinated with people that could really just sort of improvise things from whole cloth, like Keith. But of course, if you're setting up an intro for a singer, you don't have 45 minutes. You maybe have 45 seconds. And even that would be like maybe pushing it, So how can I channel a little bit of that energy? And look, by no means am I Keith Jarrett, but I always like to sit there. When I was younger, I used to sit down. I used to like to try and just sit at the piano and just see if I could do that. And of course I can't do it like Keith, but I found that, but I still found it like fun and interesting just to sort of see, wow, what can I come up with? And so I am trying to channel a little of that energy, but also, keep it succinct. And same thing for accompanying singers. Even when they're singing something rubato or in the verse, I am still improvising. I'm now accompanying, but once again, the choice of voicings, of what the sort of the tonal environment sounds like at that point, is all on me. I have no bass player to worry about. I don't have to like worry about playing good time with a drummer. I can just sort of invent whatever I want back there, and as long as it's appropriate to what the singer is doing and the song and the lyric and all that kind of stuff, then that's great.
Do you ever think literally orchestrally, like flutes or strings or brass, or is it more through the sound of the piano?
No, I know, because no, in short, is like when I'm playing the piano, I like the sound of the piano, and it's such an it's interesting that if you couldn't play more than one note at a time on the piano, it would be a useless instrument, because it has no expressive quality. The actual like sound of the instrument has no real expressive. In other words, you press down a note, and the only thing that's going to happen is it gets softer. Okay, you think about what a horn player can do. They can make it get louder, and they can make it get softer if they want to. They can also control the rate of it getting softer. We can't control. It's going to decay at the natural rate of the instrument. But horn player can make it louder, softer. They can add vibrato. They can bend the pitch. They can do all sorts of cool effects, like like a fun release or something like that. We have none of that,
Exactly.
But our superpower is we can play more than one note at once, and that's where the piano really. So I don't think orchestrally, just because I think the sound of the instrument when it's being played, more than one note at once. I think that's a very specific sound, and although you can transfer the ranges of the piano over to orchestral instruments, and if you wanted to talk about orchestrating, that's a whole other discussion. But when I'm actually playing, I'm approaching the instrument, as the instrument,
as a piano. Yeah. So how did you get started improvising? Did you start with classical, or?
I did. Yeah, I started with regular kid piano lessons when I was young. My parents were high school music teachers, so there was always music in the house, and my mom was a pretty good piano player as well. And there was a piano in the house, and I just started, picking around at it when I was a really little kid. And then I started taking regular kid piano lessons when I was about 5. And this was, that would have been the early 80s. And so the more traditional pedagogical system was still pretty much there. The woman I took lessons from was wonderful, but it was there was no improvisation was not discussed. It was basically you learn to read, you play what's on the page, and that kind of thing. And so it wasn't until but I always liked sort of messing around with chords and stuff like that. I didn't know what I was doing, but I still liked it, even though it was mostly discouraged. I got a kick out of it. And then when I got into like junior high school, then I was in the high school jazz band, and there's chord symbols on these arrangements. Now high school level big band charts, the piano parts are still fully realized. You don't have to know how to read chords, but it definitely, if you want to move off the paper, and I did, it helps to learn how to read chords. So I started taking jazz piano lessons when I was in high school, and that opened up a whole other thing.
Oh yeah, you reminded me of a quick story. When I was in college at UConn, I studied with a great composer named Hale Smith, who was also a jazz pianist, and he'd actually taught Eric Dolphy out of the Hindeman Elementary Training for book. And they were close friends. Played with Dizzy, but he said he told me about reading the charts. He was playing in a big band somewhere in the '50s, and the band leader made an announcement that Errol Garner was in the audience, who famously could not read music. And so they said, let's welcome Mr. Gardner up to play on one of our tunes. And so he sits down at the piano, and there's a chord chart, just a chord chart, really, and with some hits and whatever. And so my teacher, Hale, just sort of moved away, and Errol like, no, don't go anywhere, don't go anywhere. So the entire time, he's like, man, where are we? Where are we? Show me where. And then when it came time for him to solo, the spotlight comes on, and he played like, whatever he did. And then as soon as the spotlight went off, he's like, come here, show me where we are. I was actually shocked that he couldn't even read the chord chart. But I said, what? That's unusual. Someone who can't even follow the chords but can play that well.
Sure. Well, you go far enough back, and of course, most jazz piano players, they may have had some piano lessons as kids, but certainly the whole jazz side of things, up until probably until the mid '50s or so. Anybody who wanted to be a jazz musician, learning that, you were self-taught. There was no formal education for that. So yeah, but there's a value also in even though now that's not, it's very rare to find people that are 100% self-taught. There is still a value, because all of those musicians, you went to UConn, I went to, William Patterson and MSM, and of course, you go to any like Theory 101 class, and they start assigning names to chords. Now in classical theory, they use figured bass notation and all that kind of stuff, as opposed to, jazz chord symbols. But it's 6.5 a dozen the other. You're basically assigning like symbols to harmonic structure. And the thing is that these people that were completely self-taught, they had to have some structure in their mind. Otherwise you have nothing, but the structure is completely I'm sure they had ways of thinking of things. They assigned their own way of thinking about things. We say, well, D minor 7 goes to G7 goes to C major 7. They might not have been thinking about it in the same way, but there had to be some way of thinking about it in order to achieve, what they were capable of.
Exactly. They make their own mental construct. Sometimes they say music and math has such a relation. For me, it's not the numbers part of math. It's the sort of spatial and the geometric and the volume and relative weight. You play a big chord, and then maybe some fast high notes will balance that somehow. Like almost like geometry. Have you ever felt limited in a specific situation by your training or what you quote already know? Like, sometimes amateurs come up with creative solutions that professionals don't. I find that sometimes.
Oh yeah. No, I can't think of any specific example, but there's plenty of times. Actually, here's a good one. I don't know if this is necessarily. This is just kind of this is probably just less my training, but more. So years ago, I was doing a record date, and one of the things that I was doing was the song "A Song for You," the Leon Russell, recorded by Donny Hathaway, and the arrangement was very much in line with the Donny Hathaway version. And of course, that starts out with that thing that's descending thirds, da 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 ba ba, and that kind of thing. And I'm on the record date, and I got the chart in front of me, and I didn't have it, I didn't get the chart in advance. So I'm looking at this thing, and I'm seeing these descending major thirds, and I'm trying to work out a fingering with my right hand. How can I do this and get this to sound smooth? Okay, and try working out a fingering, and meanwhile I'm meanwhile they're getting ready to do a take, and I'm still trying to figure out how to get this to sound good, because every time I'm practicing it it still sounds lousy. Anyway, so I got it as close as I could, and we did first take, kind of ragged. Second take was better, but still there was a little hiccup in there. Third take, same deal. It wasn't good enough. Finally, the producer gets on the talk back. He says, "Have you thought about trying it with both hands?" Let's do another one.
That's great.
And then it was completely easy, because once I, I'm sitting there trying to figure out how to, and it never even occurred to me. It's like, what are you doing with your left hand right now?
Exactly. That's great. I had one of those. I was playing a lyrics and lyricists at the 92nd Street Y. It was it's called Radio Days, and we did one hit, number one hit from 1920 to 1940. And we're doing an old two beat, Guy Lombardo. I think it was Boohoo. Is that the name of it? It was like a one, bum, 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 and I worked out a really perfect 4-bar intro. And then the day, and we rehearsed like that for a long time. And then the day before we opened, the choreographer said, we need an extra measure up front, because the singers are going to, the singer quote dancers are going to step on stage on beat 1 from the wings. Mm-hmm. And so I couldn't just make it into a nice 5-bar intro, which is possible, because it wouldn't have worked. So we needed an intro. We needed an intro to the intro. Right. Because when they stepped on stage, it had to start the official intro to make it work. And I just did not that does not compute, right? That's not in my data that has entered into my musical training at all. And it took me about 3 or 4 minutes. And finally, I just did an upward chromatic thing. Boo, 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 intro. Uh-huh. But it really forced me out. I hated it at the minute. I'm like, why is she saying that? Well, can't we just move on with our lives? But then it forced me to grow. I love.
Yeah. No, actually, I think that's actually, so things like that. And I'll just sort of tie this into something else, is that, one thing with working with a lot of singers, there are, just by the way that, people wind up in the music business and that kind of thing. And you don't see it nearly as much. Well, you still see it, there are a lot of, there are some singers out there that have not had a lot of formal, musical education, just by virtue of, how they wound up in the business. And so early on, I would work with, every once in a while, I would work with somebody who hadn't had, a lot of, theory or whatever. And they would propose something for an arrangement that would go against what I thought was right. You know what I'm saying? That I had been taught, well, you do it, this is how you do it, and this is how it works, and this is why it works, and it's just what you do. And they would come in and they would want something in arrangement that would run, totally counter to what I had been taught. And initially, my first instinct would be well, that doesn't work. We can't do that. And then I started getting in the habit of just being sure, let's try it. Why not? Let's see what happens. Meanwhile, in my head, I'm thinking this isn't going to work at all. And a lot of times it wouldn't work, but every once in a while it would work. And then I would come away thinking, you know what? I'm glad I tried that, because otherwise I wouldn't have. Otherwise, I would have just shut it down and we would gone on. But what they were thinking of actually did work. Maybe I can't explain why, but it does. So I'm glad I tried it. So in general, if somebody proposes something to me, even if it seems like it doesn't agree with what my priors would say is the thing to do, I'll give it a shot. You know.
Yeah, and sometimes even if their idea doesn't work in its specifics, we have to be creative to find a way to get what they want in a way that does work, right? It forces us out of our
Yeah.
comfort zone as well.
Yep.
Let's get back to your musical influences. You mentioned Keith Jarrett. Was he the primary influence, or was there someone
No,
else?
I got to Keith a little bit late. Like I said, I started listening to him when I was in college. No, earlier, the first jazz pianist that really caught my ear was Oscar Peterson.
Hmm.
And yeah, I had had a couple of attempts at trying to appreciate jazz prior to that. I grew up in a small town in upstate New York, Hudson Falls, New York, which is about 50 miles north of Albany. And I was in high school in the early 90s, and it was still one of those things where if you wanted to listen to music, you had to go to the mall record store and buy a CD. And so I was being encouraged by like my high school band director and so on to try and get into trying to get into jazz. So I would go down to the mall record store and see if I could find something that interested me, and I would just go browsing through the stacks and everything, looking for names that I recognized. And I remember one time I found a CD by Miles Davis, ESP.
Oh my God, that was your first Miles Davis one?
Yeah. And so I pulled this thing out and I was like, oh, well, I know the name Miles Davis. That's a famous name. Great. I turned the thing over and, looked at the personnel. I see Herbie Hancock's name. I was like, well, I love playing chameleon. So, I mean, this is going in the right direction already. So, all right, this is going to be good. I got the thing home, put it on my parents' CD player, put it on, and I was so confused. Because I was expecting something, like I said, I associated Herbie Hancock with chameleon, with funky stuff, with synths. I thought this was going to be going in that direction, and I was not prepared for this very progressive sounding acoustic jazz from the mid 60s. And I listened to, I think, about 2 tunes, and then I took the thing out and was like, you know what? This isn't for me. I couldn't make heads or tails of it. So I put it aside, and I thought, you know what, maybe jazz just isn't what, maybe that's just not where I'm at. But I remember a few months later, I was in Tower Records in Boston with my dad, and he gives me a tape by Oscar Peterson. He says, "Here, why don't we get this?" He says, this guy is a really famous jazz pianist. Maybe you'll like this." And I put that tape on, and I loved it. And that changed, that kind of changed everything, because that was for me, that was much more accessible than ESP. Blues with Oscar was always front and center. And, it of course, his technical prowess was unbelievable, but I don't even think that's what caught my ear. It was the fact that it sounded joyful. Like the swing was so infectious. And like I said, the blues element was always very present. And it just was, that's what really captivated me. And so then I started listening to some more stuff by Oscar. Another record I got early on was Ahmad Jamal at the Pershing. And that record, once again, it's not, even though there's improvisation on the record, with that record, it's almost more about the ensemble. It's more about the ensemble sound. Some of that stuff almost borders on some of that stuff almost borders on R&B.
Yeah.
And I really enjoyed that. So those were kind of the things that kind of got me going, that really got me interested in jazz. And then as I was able to process that stuff, I was able to work into other other players and styles and that kind of thing. And by the time I was out of high school, I was listening to that Miles Davis 60s quintet constantly. Like at that point, I loved it. So once I was able to figure out what that was, then, but it took me, I had to work my way in.
So how does somebody become, I'll even say, highly influenced by certain players without being only an imitator or subsume. Like I remember when I was in college, I had been listening to Bill Evans since high school, for instance, and this would have been early 80s, so he had just passed away. And it seemed like every pianist in Connecticut that I knew at least would sort of hunch over and play this very mushy, watered down version of Bill Evans. And I had to just take my Bill Evans records and put them aside for literally about 20 years. So because I found it was just too easy to be a pale imitation of Bill Evans at that point, at least for me. How do you develop your own style within this set of influences?
Yeah, I think, well, yeah, so you mentioned Bill Evans, and then, when I was in college, like I said, I discovered Keith, and there were musicians. There was sort of a cult of Keith Jarrett, mentality with some, because he's such an influential person, some music, and the thing is, I found that, and then I was kind of the same. I think young people, when you discover something, you go all in with it. And that's one of the great things about, being young and enthusiastic, is that something is new, and something can only be new once, and of course when you're young, lots of things are new. And I just remember when I would discover somebody, a musician that I thought was cool, I just went all in with that person, and just trying to get trying to get as many of the records as I could, and figure out what they were doing, and that kind of, and emulate their sound. And I think then that's what you're talking about with the Bill Evans, people. So I think one thing that was good for me was, by about my junior year in college, I realized, I was like, well, Keith's unbelievable, but there's only one Keith, and really what the guy can do is sort of superhuman. So there's really no point in, like, I mean, appreciate what he does and take what you can use from it, but you're not going to be another Keith Jarrett, and I just realized, it's like, there was also a lot of, I also, like, about my junior year in college, I also realized, I was like, there are so many jazz pianists from the earlier part of the history of jazz that are worth checking out. I'd never listened to a Teddy Wilson record until I was a junior in college, and then I discovered that stuff, and I thought, this is probably worth, this is very much worth checking out. Going back and checking out players like Hank Jones and Tommy Flanagan, Teddy Wilson, so on and so forth. Those were all, I realized I had a big gap in my knowledge. And those players are great, because, it's funny, we started off talking about, you were saying, like, playing a rubato intro, and I was saying, well, it's, I like to think of it as sort of being, Keith Jarrett light or whatever, but there's also times where you just need to play a 4-bar intro at, like, like there, a solo piano thing, and then being able to draw on the harmonic, vocabulary of a Hank Jones, that's going to serve you really well. Players like that were wonderful at that.
That leads me into a little something I was going to talk to you about. You've performed with so many, and are performing with so many wonderful, famous people. Michael Feinstein, Bernadette Peters. There's a few on the list. I looked at your website just to really refresh myself and to learn about what you've been up to. You've performed with a few who particularly were a link to an older generation. I'm thinking of Barbara Cook as one.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, there's a sensibility she grew up with that just isn't there anymore, and it's just different. It's not necessarily better or worse, but she was connected with people, from Broadway in the 50s, and the people she worked with were around from the 30s and 40s. And we get kind of that. Can you speak to that a little, or any particular memories of working with Barbara?
Sure. Well, I've always loved the idea of being able to touch history. And so that, working with musicians that that came up when the music was still new, I always thought that was amazingly cool. Early on, I worked with a little bit with a singer named Bob Stewart, who passed away a few years ago, but Bob liked to have older musicians on his gigs. And I remember one day he had Frank West on this one concert, and I thought that was the coolest thing ever, because because of the history that Frank West had, and things like that. Those kinds of things, those opportunities, I thought were like, I thought that was the best stuff. And then to go on and work with singers like Barbara Cook, and I worked with Barbara a little bit at the towards the end of her performing career, and she was great. She was wonderful. And even though when I was working with her, vocally, she wasn't able to do the sort of coloratura soprano stuff that she was, famous for when she was younger, but she was still able to communicate a lyric so well. There was just sort of this understanding of how to phrase and that kind of thing. It was great. And then a person who I've worked with even more through the years has been Marilyn Maye, and Marilyn, Marilyn is still going strong at 95. And once again, the whole thing of being able to, she was making records as far back as the early to mid 60s, and once again singing some of these songs when they were still new. Now, granted, by that point, some of the stuff from the 20s and 30s was already 30 years old, but there were still songs that she was premiering. She had the first recorded version of the song Cabaret. Yeah. So to work with people like that has always been a real thrill for me. I like, because they sing this music with a certain authenticity. And it's not because they're necessarily superior musicians to people that have come after them, but that they came up hearing this music when it was still new, and they learned it when it was still in the public's, when those kinds of songs were still the popular music in this country. And there's a certain understanding of it that just comes from that, from coming up then. I mean, we're lucky. We're lucky to come up when we did, because but at the same time, it's like, when I want to play jazz with a certain amount of authenticity, it's hard for me to discount the fact that I know what rock and roll sounds like. But Marilyn Maye, when she learned this music, there was rock and roll, but it wasn't, it was still pretty. I mean, she learned this stuff. I mean, and actually, when she was actually learning it in the 40s, there was no rock and roll then. So she was learning it when it hadn't been, put through the prism of the last, 70 or 80 years.
Yeah, there wasn't even Coltrane,
Yeah. When you look at it that way, a lot of the jazz that we know, wasn't even there. So there was just, it was learning the music when there were different sounds in the air. And there's really no substitute for that.
That's a great point. You don't hear that much. I talk about that a lot too. Like when you hear Bird with Strings or Miles Davis playing Will You Still Be Mine or something, or a Gal and Calico. Bing Crosby was on the radio every day and on TV. You hear that sweetness, right? Or when Ella would sing the Great American Songbook, not particularly jazzy. It's something that informed the jazz musicians, even the real hard boppers, when they played a ballad or just a sweet little phrase in there. You don't hear that as much anymore among the younger players, unless they've gone back and checked it out.
Yeah, no, and there are younger players who have. It's just that we can't unknow what we know. You know what I'm saying? It's like we live. We're fish that swim in an ocean where the water has a lot of contemporary popular music in it, so we can't unknow that we know what Billy Joel sounds like. And I think it's great that we know what Billy Joel sounds like. That's not a bad thing, but it's one of those things where learning, I had to learn how to play jazz. I had to learn the Great American Songbook. I'm glad I learned it. I love it. It's what I do every day. It's great, but I had to learn to do it. It wasn't in the air to be had, and that's what's different with that generation of musicians. It just happens that I love the sound, that I just really love that particular sound, and I'm always trying to get as close to it as I can, but once again, I can't unknow what I know, but but I try.
Well, maybe that's the sort of a roundabout answer to my question about avoiding being subsumed by your influences, because we've been influenced by other things too that they weren't. So maybe
Right.
that's
Yeah.
part of
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. And that's the thing is, yeah. And so, yeah, like it or not, we're here when we're here. And for the most part, I do like it, and I get to work with great people and play good music and that kind of thing. So,
So Michael Feinstein. So you're his musical director. He, from what I've seen on some posts he's done on the internet, he loves working with you. Probably as a person as well. Seems like as a person as well as a working relationship, music.
sure.
And you're part of an ongoing concert series at Zanko Hall at Carnegie Hall,
Yep.
three
Yeah.
times a year.
3 times, yes, 3 times a year. Michael's had the series. Michael has had the series for a long time, probably close to probably going on 20 years. And so it changed format a little bit about, I don't know, 7 or 8 years ago, when they started having the house band be Michael's working trio in New York. And so I believe I think that I think next season, yeah, we have 3 dates. November, let's see here, November 15th. I'm just going over my calendar really quick. November 15th, February 28th, and March 27th.
Oh, so that's 2023 into 24.
Yep.
So I remember when Michael first hit the national scene, and I've seen him on TV and everything. He would always be at the piano singing with that such boyish, joyful enthusiasm, right? He just exudes this enthusiasm
Yep.
in a way that harks back, really. And the first thought I had when I heard you were working with him originally is, boy, I didn't know he used another pianist. I mean, why, just to sort of put it out there, why does Michael Feinstein want to work with another pianist? Is it he likes to stand up and sing, or did he want a fresh musical input? I mean, what do you think?
Well, he started doing it before I worked with him, so I don't know the exact impetus of why he made the change. I do think he did want to stand up and sing some more. Yeah, initially I think the first person who was working as Michael's MD was John Otto, who unfortunately passed away too young a few years ago. And I learned a lot from John. We were sort of, for a while, we were doing the gig around the same time. And so I learned a lot from him about being a musical director, being an arranger, and that kind of thing. And I do think Michael, once again, Michael is a complete performer as a singer and pianist, and so I think he does enjoy having the different approach, of having, whatever it is that I or whoever's playing for him at the time, bring to it. It's fun for me, because once again, I know that, as a pianist, he's able to express what he wants very clearly. And that's great. We have a great time working together. So
Do you ever feel like remember when Billy Strayhorn would play with Ellington, uncredited, like on Masterpieces by Ellington? That's like at least a half, maybe 2/3 Strayhorn. But Strayhorn would play like Ellington, so you almost didn't know the difference.
yeah.
Do you feel any need, or even do you feel like you have to play a little bit like him, or do you just totally just bring your own self
No,
to
I
it?
just do my own thing.
Yeah.
And that's it. That's the other thing is that because he still will play several songs in an evening. I don't do the entire night. He will come over and do a few things. And so no, when I'm accompanying him, I'm just trying to do my thing. And so no, he's no, yeah, he, you know, and because he's great at what he does, and I feel good about what I do, and they seem to coexist well together.
That's great. They certainly do. And he loves, I watched a few videos. He loves working with you. He'll just turn over
Ah,
around
well,
smiling.
likewise. We really
Yeah.
do have a fun time together. And I've been working with him now. Now it's been, a dozen years. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
A few specific questions about working with vocalists, if I may.
Sure.
What what's the relationship between you and your playing and the lyrics? I was shocked once. There's an interview with Bill Evans. Len Lyons did it for Keyboard Magazine, and it's been published in books, and it's probably on the internet now. Where, he asked about those classic Bill Evans, Tony Bennett albums, where it's almost telepathic between the two of them. And he said, what about the lyrics? And Bill Evans was just very curt. He said, could care less about lyrics. Tony might as well be a horn player for all I'm concerned. And I thought, okay, he's got this sensitivity that he can take in something from the sound of the voice. That maybe the lyric influences Tony's tone, and then it influences Bill Evans. But how do you feel about that? That's very unusual for a great accompanist not to pay attention to lyrics. Or
Yeah. It's interesting. One thing I've found is that I know a million lyric fragments. I
yeah,
know about three complete lyrics.
yeah,
Like I know bits and pieces to many songs. But I can only get through like a handful of them, uh without like blanking on something. So I've never made, so that's just a way of saying that I've never made a concerted effort to actually learn the complete lyrics to a song, but I've learned a lot of them by osmosis. I try and be conscious of what the lyric is communicating. I think that's I mean, the singer certainly has to be. I should be as well. So I'm always, I focus on that kind of thing. And the other thing is you play these songs enough and the lyric becomes the overall theme of the song. That's the other thing. That's the great thing about a lot of great American songbook songs, is that the lyrics are not overly specific. Okay. And I think that's by design, to a certain extent, because they wanted these songs to be applicable to a variety of situations, and appeal to a variety of people. And so there is, I think you find with a lot of these songs, they have a general theme to them, whether it's I want to be in love with you, I was in love with you, we are in love, that kind of thing, these really sort of broad strokes. And so once you know what that general theme is, then what general color you're going to want to use, in your in your playing for that particular song, so that there's not a reason to necessarily know the lyric with like a super high degree of specificity. You don't have to know that they use the word but instead of and there, and it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. But if you know overall what the sentiment of the song is, then you got a good jumping off point. And after you've heard a few of these songs a dozen times, you'll know forever what that song is about.
yeah, exactly. That's a good point. And there's this, even within this, I love, she loves, whatever we love. There each song has a like an emotional take on it. So if you'll play the intro to Misty, for instance, a little differently than you might, if it's about vulnerability, right? You're as helpless as a kitten up a tree. You don't have to know every second verse and third A section, right? But it's
Right.
a little different than the nearness of you, which might be more like an embrace or something, right?
Right. And of course there are when you start like taking a little bit of a deeper look, there are ways with some of these songs, take a song like Will You Still Be Mine? There's a good example of a song where it's often taken at a breakneck pace. But when you start to look at the lyric, it's like, will you still be mine? It's like there's you can approach that from a lighthearted place, but you can also approach it from a more serious place. Same thing with a song like Lover Come Back to Me. Another song that's generally taken at a really fast clip. When you look at the lyric, it's not necessarily a happy song. Just one of those things. I think of that as generally it can be read as a very melancholy lyric, but it's often taken as a really up-tempo, exuberant thing. So, there are ways of getting more than one read on this thing. And it's interesting to see over the course of time how songs have kind of wound up being performed certain ways. When you take a look at the lyric, it's like, really? Yeah, it doesn't quite read, but who am I to not want to play Love Will Come Back to Me as fast as humanly possible? So.
Exactly. I remember that reminds me when I was Gerry Mulligan's assistant, 87 and 88. It was great for me to just be around somebody like that, photocopying music and carrying his sax and stuff. But he did a gig, and I'm not going to mention the specifics because the arranger is still with us. But Doc Severinsen was on the bill with him and played a very famous standard somewhere, and did it in a traditional way. Like, people have been playing this certain standard the same way since the 30s. And, Doc Severinsen, big brassy trumpet player, just brought the house down, like these big clarion call things, the big band swinging. And I was just in heaven standing there soaking it up. And on the way back to the hotel, we're driving back afterwards, and Gerry, it was just the two of us, and he was just laying into it. He goes, "Ron, I can't understand it. The only way I can justify it, the whole performance, is that the arranger must have hated the song. The arranger must have just hated that." And I'm thinking, I couldn't say anything to him, but I'm thinking, well, it's been done like that since the 30s, so it wasn't this arranger. Doc might have requested it, but also, what's the problem? I mean, it was a great, great performance. And that stayed with me. And I think about 10 years later, I realized it's what you're talking about. The lyric is just sweet. It's just sweet,
Yeah.
So a little change of venue midway through this, and we're back. Just a couple more questions about specifically working with vocalists or performing in general, really. What do you do, speaking of piano improvisation, that aspect, what do you do on those days when it's just not working as easily as it, you play the intro, it sounds good, or you're soloing, but it's not quite flowing the way you want. Do you have any thoughts on that? What do you do?
Yeah, I think one of the things is that I think part of being a professional is that one of the things is that you develop a way of at least developing sort of a minimal level of something. You always want your best stuff to be coming out. We all do, right? But I think one of the nice things about doing this over a long period of time is that you learn that even on those days when you don't have your best stuff, you know how to at least go in there and get something that'll get the job done. I know that's not a great answer, but
No.
but that's mostly, we all, and you know what? I think we all know within like usually a few bars whether it's going to be like one of those nights where everything is clicking, or whether it's going to be one of those nights where we're going to have to like go to that reserve. And then say things can change over the course of a gig. Sometimes I'll get off to a slow start, and then I'll be like, and then something will kick in, and it's great. But then some nights it's just going to be one of those things where it's like, it's just not happening. So I think you just know how to deliver a certain baseline of whatever, and you always hope that you can do a lot more than that.
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes the flow starts happening without forcing it, right? Something just lets go or whatever, or you play a lick or two that and then that becomes fun, right? Or I'm sure you've had that kind of experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what about soloing in general? When you're doing your own trio gig or something, or solo piano, you obviously play what you want, basically. You're creating the arrangement. And there's different types of singers, right? There's straight ahead jazz singers that, sort of in that, I guess, Ella Fitzgerald tradition or whatever. So they sing, and then it's your turn to play, and then maybe the bass player. But then there's other vocalists who have more structured charts. So you might only get like, it's almost like playing in a big band. You get your 16 measures or something.
All right.
What are your thoughts on what interpretations you as a pianist bring to the table? Do you feel that like when it's your 16 measures, you could do whatever you want, it's your time, or do you work within this sort of emotional umbrella that the vocalist has established, or sometimes little of each? I don't know.
Um, yeah, for the most part, if it's going to be something that brief, and a lot of times it is, I don't want to make a lot of. I generally don't want to break whatever vibe has been established by the singer. I don't want to disrupt that necessarily. Maybe develop it a little bit, but as far as just like go in there and try something completely different, most of the time, no. Unless it seems like a really, unless it seems like that I could do that and it would be, cool. But I think most of the time, no. I think I'd just be trying to keep the vibe going, and yeah, just yeah, maintain the status quo.
Yeah, that's a great answer, and that's certainly a big part of why vocalists like working with you, because I hear sometimes people do the other way, and it can work as you said, but sometimes it's like, what? Then the singer has to work 10 times harder when they come back in to get back where they were.
Sure. Yeah.
So final topic, your own album starting now,
Mm-hmm.
and I listened to a little bit and on your website, and I noticed that the first thing that struck me, which was really interesting, was that the tunes are not your typical jazz piano trio tunes. I mean, some of them are, but you did, like Sunday, or especially What a Little Moonlight Can Do, which is, I don't think I've ever heard an instrumental version of that before. They're tunes that I've always associated with vocalists.
Yeah.
Did you do this because this is your sort of professional thing, or were these your favorite tunes and you didn't care? Or
yeah, they were more just songs that I enjoyed, and I was probably aware of them because I do work with a lot of singers. Yeah, that's interesting. I've never even made the connection that some of those are not ones that have a lot of instrumental versions of. I just like the songs, and when I sort of set out to make the record, I just thought, well, what are some tunes you like playing? And those were ones that made the cut.
I'm glad you did. It's wonderful, and I loved, and I think this was your chance to play the intros that you might feel, right. You didn't have to think about anybody else's interpretations too. You could express yourself on them. And
sure, yeah. It's funny though, over the course of time, I find I'm so used to trying to fit into with what somebody else's concept is, that trying to settle on one of my own can be a little bit of a challenge. But I'm overall, I'm happy with the way the record turned out, and it's got a couple of great musicians on there, David Fink on bass and Mark McLean on drums, and both of those guys I've known for many years, and so it was fun making it, and yeah, fun to play some of those things in an instrumental context.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad you had the chance to do it, and people can find it at teddfirth.com,
Yep.
website. And Ted, I want to thank you for this. This was such a fun conversation, and pianists never get to talk to one another like this. We're the only pianist on the gig, and unless you're playing with Michael Feinstein, I guess. And real delight for me, and I think for everybody watching and listening. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ron. It's been great doing this.
Yeah, so if you were tuning in, thanks for joining us, and check out Ted and wherever he's playing. Go to his website, look him up on social media, or at Carnegie Hall with Michael Feinstein. And good luck with your own playing, and as always, enjoy the journey and let the music flow.